So it seems that the death of physical games media is upon us. As I'm sure you have heard by now, Sony officially announced that they are no longer going to be selling physical game discs as of 2028, and this has widely been regarded as an unpopular move to say the least. However, and I'll admit that this might be a somewhat controversial thing to say, but I think that all of these people that are focusing so hard on wanting them to bring back physical media and maintain it forever are kind of missing the forest for the trees. If your goal is to maintain ownership of your games and be able to preserve them long into the future, I think you might be fighting the wrong battle. Don't get me wrong, the death of physical media is absolutely a bad thing for plenty of reasons. But let's stop and think about this for a second. What is a video game? And I mean this in a very literal sense. Like, from a technological perspective, what does a video game actually consist of when you buy it? Well, by definition, a video game is a piece of software. It's a bunch of digital code and assets bundled together into a single product. That's what differentiates it from, say, a board game or sports and whatnot. So, when you buy a physical video game, what are you actually buying? Well, you're buying a digital product that someone printed onto a disc or a cartridge, a physical piece of hardware, to store that information before giving it to you. And in turn, well, what is a digital game that you might buy off of Steam? Well, it's a digital product that you download yourself to store on your local hard drive, a physical piece of hardware that you own to store that information for yourself. Like, ultimately, when you break it down from this technological perspective, the difference between a physical game and a digital game is mostly cosmetic. If I downloaded a game right now and then put it on a flash drive or an SD card or something, and then I compared that to buying a physical Switch 2 cartridge, why is one of these considered physical and the other considered digital? They're both pieces of portable hardware that I'm using to transport a digital product. If I swapped the data between the cartridge and the flash drive, does that magically transform one into a digital game and the other one into a physical? Or vice versa? This is what I mean when I'm arguing that people are missing the forest for the trees. Trying to make this distinction between digital and physical media and to fight for physical media to stay around forever is not only impractical, but it also doesn't really address the real problem happening here. Because I think that what's really happening is that a lot of people are upset, but they are kind of misdiagnosing what they are upset about. People usually prefer physical media because of the greater sense of ownership it provides. The ability to hold a game in your hands and know that it is yours to do with as you please feels great. After all, this comes hot on the heels of another big Sony news story where they pulled something like 500 movies from their digital storefront, which shouldn't have been that noteworthy, except for the fact that they also are deleting those movies from your local hard drives if you purchased it from them, which is just so patently absurd, but that is a topic for another day. So I think that it is natural that people's gut reaction to news like this is that clearly digital media is evil and physical media is much more preferable if you want to actually own and keep things for yourself. But here's the thing, that hasn't been true for at least a decade, if not longer. It used to be true that owning a physical game meant that you, owned it, but that was only because of the more rudimentary and hardware-based DRM that older games were forced to operate on due to the limitations of their time. Buying a physical game nowadays isn't the same as was 20 years ago. More advanced DRM methods have allowed publishers to run rampant and take away our rights as consumers with ease. If companies wanted to make a physical DVD for a movie that just had a bit of code on it that required you to connect to the internet in order to watch that film, they absolutely could. And then in turn, that would allow them to shut down your ability to use that physical DVD at any time of their choice by simply removing your access to that server, just like how they took away all of those digital movies. And I'm sure that the more skeptical or naive among you might be thinking that, that's an absurd hypothetical. But the thing is that companies already do this all the time. It's just that it's usually done with video games instead of movies. If you're familiar with the Stop Killing Games movement, then you should know about a little game called The Crew, which is what kickstarted this whole thing off. The short version is that The Crew was a racing game from I think 2014 that was published by Ubisoft, and in 2024 they shut off the game's servers, rendering the entire game unplayable due to its online components, despite the fact that the game actually had a single-player campaign as well. So even that aspect of the game that shouldn't have needed an online connection was still taken away from anybody who purchased it. But here's the thing, The Crew was also a physical game. It didn't matter if you downloaded it digitally or if you went into a store to buy a physical copy. Either way, you got screwed when they shut down those servers, and there was nothing you could do about it. Sure, I guess if you bought the physical version, then, well, you get to keep the disc, and maybe it makes for a good coaster for your drinks when you have guests over, but as a game, it's been rendered completely useless. And this happens all the time for any kind of game with any kind of online component or online-based DRM. The way you purchased the game, whether it was digital or physical, never actually mattered in the first place, at least not since they've started doing this kind of thing. So it can always be taken away from you. So, if you've been listening to all this news and you're upset about physical media going the way of the dinosaur, in my opinion at least, what you should be focusing on right now is fighting back against abusive DRM practices and supporting initiatives like Stop Killing Games. Because if we can defeat DRM, or at least make it a lot less draconian, then digital media can be just as physical as you want it. Like, for example, take a look at the Good Old Games Store, otherwise known as GOG or the GOG launcher. It's a digital store just like Steam, except it's owned by the guys that made Cyberpunk and The Witcher. But the main selling point of GOG is that the games on it are totally DRM free. So it doesn't matter if a company shuts down its servers, or even if GOG itself just disappears one day. Once you buy a game from this store and install it on your machine, nobody can take that game away from you, despite it being totally digital. And arguably, this makes it far easier to preserve these games in the long term. Don't get me wrong, a physical game collection can look awesome and last for a long time, but that's only because for a while, like I said, physical games were only limited by hardware-based DRM. There was just physically no way for them to shut down your access to like an NES or a GameCube game remotely. But if you accidentally scratch a disc or you break a cartridge, well then the game is gone forever if you can't back it up to make a copy, since most people don't have the hardware necessary to, say, copy the ROM off of an NES cartridge. Whereas, if you buy a game off of GOG, well, I can make backups of it on a different hard drive, on a different computer. So even if my desktop gets nuked from orbit, well then that doesn't have to be the end of my games library. Hell, you can download one of these games, transfer it onto a flash drive, and then lend it to your friend for a while, and then they can play it for themselves, just like you would with a physical game. It's kind of the best of both worlds. And I'm not saying that because I have some kind of preference for digital media. I'm saying that because this is an example of how the only reason we weren't able to do this stuff before was because of DRM. Simply removing DRM from the equation suddenly gives the consumer a lot more power again. Not to mention that I feel like GOG merely existing at all as a successful platform helps show that all of this overly aggressive DRM just isn't necessary for modern games. Most companies try to justify it by arguing that they need to protect against piracy and whatnot, but as the great Gaben once said, piracy has always been more of an issue with service rather than a security problem. If you offer a better, more convenient service than what somebody can get through piracy, then customers will be willing to pay for it. Steam merely existing as such a good platform with tons of features, and especially the constant sales that have very deep discounts, this has almost certainly done far more to combat piracy than any kind of security or DRM ever has to date. Meanwhile, I have to imagine that, doing something like deleting hundreds of movies that people paid for with their hard-earned money right off of their PS5 hard drives with no compensation, well, that sounds like something that's a lot more likely to get people to start sailing the seven seas, if you ask me. And honestly, Sony only has themselves to blame for that. As they say, if buying isn't owning, then I guess pirating isn't stealing. So, does the death of physical media suck? Of course. Some people rely on physical retailers when they might not have a stable enough internet connection for one reason or another to download games that weigh hundreds of gigabytes. Not to mention that the used physical market was a great way to get games for much cheaper without having to rely on specific platforms like PlayStation or Nintendo that almost never have big sales on their main IPs. But over time, these companies have been forcing more and more draconian DRM practices on us for years, and begging for them to keep supporting physical media forever isn't going to change that. If you lack a good internet connection, well, then it won't matter if you have a physical game or not, if that game still requires you to be online after you install it. And publishers have been actively making it harder and harder to resell your games for decades, physical or otherwise, again, usually through these aggressive DRM policies. So if a game comes out and doesn't employ these annoying DRM practices, then yeah, buying a physical copy is a safe bet to ensure your long-term ownership, but then usually the same is true for buying it digitally as well, since again, the difference is mostly cosmetic at this point. It only matters what the actual DRM practices are. Ultimately, physical games have been on the way out for a long time for a variety of reasons. PC games are almost entirely digital now, and to the point that most computers these days don't even bother coming with disk drives. Mobile games were never physical to begin with, and tons of companies like Capcom have been reporting that something like 90% of their sales are digital now. So like, yeah, and also I do know that there has been some argument and dispute over some of those sales figures that I just mentioned, because some people have been arguing that the numbers might be fudged a bit in favor of digital sales because of things like DLC, which are obviously going to be digital only in most cases these days. But I feel like this is like trying to stop a tsunami with a towel. Yeah, okay, maybe the numbers aren't as bad for physical media as it sounds in the news, but the clear trend has been established for years now, and trying to argue semantics and die on this hill is just kind of a pointless death at this point. Even if we somehow manage to convince companies like Sony to continue to support physical media for a few more years, that won't change the fact that, again, modern day DRM allows them to manipulate and take away those games on a whim, whether you buy a physical copy or not. But the death of physical media doesn't have to be the death of ownership. Instead of trying to fight for a dying format where companies can still screw us over anyways, we need to instead focus on supporting efforts like Stop Killing Games and storefronts like Good Old Games, because if these initiatives are able to make some real progress and get actual consumer protection laws about this put in place, well, then it won't matter whether you buy a disc from a store or you download it off the internet, because then your games will actually be yours to own and share with as you please, no matter what. But, as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. Hopefully what I'm saying here today makes at least some amount of sense, but of course it does still suck to lose out on an entire format like this, even if we are able to somehow get better consumer protection laws passed and make this DRM stuff way less annoying. Though, in my opinion, in like an ideal world, I feel like there could be a marriage between these formats. Like, you should be able to go to a physical game store and like order a physical game to be printed on demand. Like, imagine if you could go in and they would just have like a database that just has like, you know, copies of all of the games that are in their library that they're allowed to sell, and then instead of having to have that disc printed in some factory and shipped across the world, just have them burn a new copy in the store on demand. Then you print out a cover, slip it all into a case that you could just buy from wherever, and then bam, brand new physical game for those that can't afford or don't have the means to download it themselves, and, you know, all the usual advantages of having it physically without all the hassle of having to ship it across the planet or anything like that. And I mean, that would also allow for these kinds of stores to offer services like being able, like, you could bring in a scratch disc or even a broken one, and then they could just print you a new one because it would barely cost them anything. Like, these discs basically cost nothing on their own, and all that it takes to print them is time. So yeah, you throw in probably like $1 or $2 to replace a disc. Like, that could actually be a legitimately great service if companies allowed for the stores to do that. Because again, the divide between this idea of physical and digital games is mostly just an arbitrary distinction. But I'm getting a little bit sidetracked, so to wrap things up, if you like the video, make sure to leave me a like and hit that subscribe button if you want to see more content like this in the future. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.